So today I want to go through kind of the part two. I find this stuff really interesting, and I hope everybody else does. I was going through this thinking I probably should focus more on first principles, but they say focus on what you enjoy, and I really find this stuff fascinating because it's hard to watch TV or read anything where like the Bible's a fairy tale, it's a fable. There's zero historical proof, there's zero archaeological proof, but I don't know who those people think they're kidding because everything you read seems to match up with stuff from the Bible, and so. Last time I talked a little bit about can we place the date where Joseph would occur kind of during the realm of the Egyptians? And whether it's right or not, there's some pretty compelling evidence. So I was going to quickly review that again and then just go into a few other things, kind of referring to maybe what was going on at the time of Joseph. Could it have really taken place? About what time was the Exodus and that kind of interesting historical facts. So I'll run through this. These are what I used a lot of. The patterns of Exodus, or patterns of evidence Exodus video. There's a lot of the archaeologists that do the studies are in that video. There's the accuracy of the Bible that comes from 1930s, reliability of the Old Testament. There's a bunch of different books out there from mostly not all these, but most of these are Egyptologists, they're archaeologists. Most of these are atheists, which is really interesting. They're not necessarily religious people. So it's kind of interesting when they're like, well, this does seem to kind of match up, seeing they really don't have any skin in the game as far as trying to prove it from a biblical standpoint. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So this is just a review of what we went through last time, and I usually talk fast anyway, but I'll try to go through this in a slower pace. But again, this would be a review of what we went through last time. So when we look at the Egyptian timeline, there's three major times. There's the Old Kingdom where the pyramids were built. There's this Middle Kingdom where they really kind of increased on knowledge and writing and culture. And then we have the New Kingdom where you think about King Tut and Ramses where they built all these magnificent monuments. And so those are well documented. Between those, you have a first intermediate period, a second intermediate period, and then the most kind of controversial is this third intermediate period because the timeline might be off on that. Because on these intermediate periods is a part of destabilization of the Egyptian kingdom, and there's not as much archaeological historical evidence. There's a lot of turmoil. Sometimes they don't even control the whole land. So generally, when you look at the people talking about when the Exodus was, it's either going to be around the 15th century, usually around 1446, which would be during that second intermediate period, or it's hundreds of years different in about 1200s during the time of Ramses and during the New Kingdom. So the ongoing thing was, well, if it took place around the 1200s BC during the times of Ramses, we've got tons and tons of Egyptian archaeological evidence. There's zero proof of any sort of Semitics living there, Canaanites. There's no Exodus, so there's no way it could have taken place. And so that's really was the ongoing thing for quite a few years, especially in the early 1900s. And then they're like, well, maybe our timeline's not right. Maybe the Exodus took place many years before this. And in that case, there seems to be an abundance of evidence. So that's kind of what we're going to go through on this. So first we have to start with the well-established date, which we talked about last time. Most people, regardless of what camp they're in, say we agree that the date of the construction of the Temple of Solomon was about 967, at least the way we do calendars these days. How did they come up with that? And they also agree about 586 is when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. So we have almost 400 years that this first temple, the Temple of Solomon, was built and was around in some form or another. And so how is 967 BC such a agreed upon date? Well, it goes back to old archaeological records, it goes back to old historians. But more recently, you have these two gentlemen, which we talked about last time. These guys are early archaeologists that they worked separately, but at the same time. And supposedly the story is they didn't know about each other's work, and they were presenting at a conference, and they both presented the date for Solomon's Temple, 967, unaware of each other's work, which is really interesting in itself. Edward Thiel compared biblical dates with archaeology, but he's also the one that came up with the regnal dates. He's the one that's credited saying, well, we have these Assyrian records of these kings that match the biblical records of kings, but the dates don't match. How many years they were king don't match. And he's the one that says, well, you have to determine the regnal dates. If a king took over halfway through the year, did they consider that his first year of reign, or was it the first full year of his reign? And different kingdoms did different ones. And once he figured that out, then the archaeological evidence and the biblical evidence seem to match perfectly. So he's the one that's given credit for kind of figuring out how they determine regnal dates. And then Valerius Cook, at the same time, said, I'm not going to use the Bible. I'm not even going to use as much of the archaeological. I'm just going to use historians. And so both of them, and we went through kind of how they went through this last time, came up with this 967 BCE as the date of Solomon's temple. And so we have all this information. We can use Assyrian history, we can use Greek history, we can use Egyptian history, which we'll focus on this time. And then, of course, the biblical history, which, if you're from the camp, which a lot of are, that the Bible is a fairy tale, well, then you're not going to believe the biblical history. Except the fact that the biblical history matches so much of this other stuff is really interesting. It's hard to just ignore and say, oh, it's a fairy tale, maybe loosely based off historical events. So then how do we get the Exodus date? Well, we go to First Kings. We're assuming this would be an accurate date. So First Kings 6:1 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel will come out of the land of Egypt." So after the Exodus, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziph, which is the second month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So if we take the scripture as being accurate, and we already agree 967 is the date of Solomon's temple, well, from First Kings 6:1, then we add 480 years. And so we have the Exodus date somewhere in this mid 15th century. Now, whether it's exactly 1446 or 1447, I'm not really sure. But if we're agreeing on Solomon's date, then we're all going to agree somewhere in the middle 15th century is when the Exodus took place. That would be in the intermediate period of the Egyptians. It would not be later on. So not only that, we have Jephthah. There's tons of archaeological evidence. So most people don't believe in the period of the judges when you look at historians. There is so much archaeological evidence that kind of points towards the time of the judges. We have Egdon's castle. We have the burning of Hazor. We've got all these different things that match the time of the judges. So most people are like, well, if Jephthah existed, he existed around 1100 BC. And there's different even Egyptian kind of statues that point towards that. So if we have Jephthah, and he assume he exists, and he existed around 1100, Jephthah in the Bible and Judges is saying, listen, we've been here for 300 years. Now you're trying to take over our land, as he's talking to the king of Ammon. So if we're like, okay, well, if we look at the Bible, and pretty much everybody's agreeing that Jephthah was around 1100 BC, and in Judges, he says, we've been here 300 years. And if you read Josephus, Josephus says, he wasn't being specific. If you actually read the original text, he says, for above 300 years, we've been in the land. So we get 1100 where Jephthah lived before he became a judge. And then we have him saying, we've been in this land for over 300 years. You haven't messed with us in this time. Plus, we know the Israelites wandered for 40 years. That brings us right back to the same date. The mid 15th century would be the Exodus. So all these are kind of fitting really nice. But forget the Bible. If you don't even want to look at the Bible and you're like, oh, I don't believe any of that, we have two Egyptian relics that also point to there's no way the Exodus occurred during the 1200s. The biggest one is the Merneptah stele. So Merneptah was an Egyptian pharaoh after Ramses II in the New Kingdom. And this is one of the biggest things they point to that's the oldest reference of the nation of Israel existing outside of the Bible. So the nation of Israel never existed. It's make believe. Well, the Egyptian pharaohs seem to think they existed. So, I mean, how could we say that? And there's a lot of writing on this. And what they say is the Egyptians, like the Assyrians, like everybody, if they win, they wax poetic and they talk about it and it's wonderful. If they lose, there's usually nothing. It's historically silent. Same for the Assyrians, same for the Greeks. They're not really proud of their losses, but if they win, they carve it all over the place. So what this is referring to, and they say this takes place around the time of the judges, and a lot of the dating for the judges is because of this Merneptah stele. But one of the lines is Israel is wasted, its seed is not, and Canaan is because a widow has become a widow because of Egypt. So what they're referring to here is probably at the time of the judges, some local tribes or some area is being attacked, but they're already called Israel. The nation's already called Israel. So if we have the time of Judges, we have the Egyptian king after Ramses talking about because of Egypt, we're attacking some of these Canaanite, Israelite areas. And this is definitely dated at 1208. How could the Exodus have taken place in 1220? It's too early. They haven't had time to 40 years to wander or even set themselves up to be attacked. So this says, well, clearly the Exodus had to take place before then. So it takes us right back to either the 15th or 14th century. And there's another relic. There's actually about six, but these are the two biggest ones. The Berlin pedestal was a fragment. And again, this is the Egyptians. When they take over, they conquer, or they win a small battle, they engrave it. And so this is part of a pedestal that's in Berlin. That's why it's called the Berlin pedestal. And it's again, we don't know the exact date and we don't know the exact king. So there's a lot of controversy, but generally they say this is about the same area, the 1200s. And what this shows is these are the people that we have taken over or conquered. It's part of them. And they actually list Canaan, Ashkelon, and Israel. And what they say with the Israel one had to be reconstructed because only that partial part was there. But everybody agrees the only thing it could be was the symbols for Israel. So here we are again at the time of the judges, where the Egyptians, though they're not mentioned specifically in the judges, they think the Egyptians had a lot of power and control over some of these these people around there that were attacking. And so here's two archaeological evidence that one, the nation of Israel existed and they were called Israel, but also pointing to the fact that the Exodus had taken place earlier than the 1200s because they're already referring to these tribes around that same time. So, how did this whole, well, it had to take place in the 13th century. It had to. Well, that was that William Albright. He was an archaeologist, Palestinian, called himself Palestinian in the 1930s, and he took it all off Exodus. So if we read Exodus 1:11, where Ramses, let me pull that up. Exodus 1, verse 11. Therefore did they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. So this is when the Egyptians are starting to burden the people. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. And so this archaeologist is like, well, if the slave Egyptians built Ramses, well, the Ramses name didn't occur until the New Kingdom under King Ramses II. There was no city named Ramses, there's no pharaoh named Ramses. So if we're using the word Ramses, clearly it took place in the 13th century, not the 15th. And that's what he went off of. That's it. And so everybody's like, oh, well, let's look for evidence around the New Kingdom, around the 13th century. Nobody found any, so like the Exodus didn't exist. But all he did was go off one verse. But if you look even farther into there, this is an anachronism. This is a familiar naming city for the people at the time they're writing it, but it wasn't necessarily the name when you look back, like they say Gaul for France. And there's many examples of this in the Bible. I put up a few of them. The geographic term Ramses can easily be explained as anachronism. It was probably a verse at the time. So if you look at Genesis 47 at the time of Jacob, this is even before then. He refers to Ramses as a city. Though we know there's no way Ramses existed then, but even more so if we look at Genesis 14:14, Abraham and his men are chasing Mesopotamian armies northwards towards Dan. Dan wasn't even born. So there definitely wasn't a place called Dan at this point. So all these are anachronisms, which we use all the time. They're telling the current reader the name of the city that they'd be familiar with, not the ancient name of the city. So it was a really weak argument. And the good thing is now, when you read the more current stuff from these archaeologists, they've all pretty much dissed this. Even in my lifetime, this was the ongoing thing. Under Ramses II, 13th century is when the Exodus occurred. It didn't occur. But now they're all like, eh. And since that video came out, a lot of them have changed their mind because they're like, oh, it is an anachronism. We can't base our entire thing off one verse. It doesn't make sense. So it's kind of interesting. So the things are shifting now. They still have excuses why it didn't happen, but now most people are pushing it a bit earlier. So I thought that was really interesting. So let's assume we're correct, and we don't know, but it's really fun and it's interesting and things seem to match. So 967, the date of Solomon's temple, and somewhere in that mid 15th century, plus or minus a couple hundred years, we've got the Exodus. So now let's look at biblical prophecy and see how this lines up with all this. And this is still kind of a review of last time. So if we read Genesis 15, 13 through 16, which I put up on the screen here, until going through this, I didn't realize this is a biblical prophecy given to Abraham. Abraham's already told, which is amazing. Hey, this is going to happen to your people, and on this date, they're going to be freed. They're going to have the Exodus. And so Genesis 15, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And that nation whom thou wilt serve will I judge, and afterwards they will come out with great substance. And I put the Exodus reference because if you remember, after the death of the firstborn on the plagues, what did they do? They took all the silver and gold and everything from the Egyptians. They took all that and left. So they happened to, after being slaves, they left with great substance. This has already been prophesied to Abram. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and shall be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So we already have this 400 years affliction, but in the fourth generation this will be over with, given to Abram. And then later in Exodus, we're told the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So we have all these dates were given. And then the big question was the 430 and 400 the same? Is one a approximation, one exact? What about the fourth generation? And there's been much earlier kind of biblical historians that try to make sense of this, which makes sense to me. Whether it's right or not, we can look into it. So he was told in 4 generations, you're going to be kind of in this area. 4 generations are going to be sojourning in Egypt. If we just simply look through Chronicles and we look at the timeline, it doesn't make sense. If we go from Joseph entering Egypt to Moses and Aaron leaving Egypt, that's only about 215 years. So if we assume this 430 years in Egypt, it doesn't make sense with the Bible. There's a big gap, and that's the chart over to the left. If we look to the right and we actually go through the chronology of it, well, this 4 generations sojourning only took about 215 years. So what's going on with this 430-year sort of prophecy or telling us of that? Well, they've explained it that first of all, when we read Exodus 12:40, and all the earlier manuscripts, it says the sojourning of the children of Israel will be in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was 430 years. So right there, we got rid of the land of Canaan. But if we look at the Sumerian Pentateuch, we look at Syrian manuscripts, look at the Septuagint, you look at even the Dead Sea Scrolls, they all say in Exodus 12:40, the sojourning of the children of Israel was in Egypt and the land of Canaan. So if we know the whole sojourning period is that, then it seems to make a little bit more sense and it seems to fit with these prophecies. Now, why they don't have that back in the King James, I'm not really sure. So Henry Ainsworth in the 1600s said we can look at all these kind of quotes and prophecies, and they make sense if we make them sort of start. So when God makes his prophecy to Abram, you're going to be sojourning for 430 years. Towards the Exodus seems to fit with these dates. So what about the enslavement of 400 years? Now, whether this is right or not, I don't know, but I thought it was really interesting. He's like, well, you think 25 years later, Isaac's born, but it says 430 years. What's interesting, when Isaac was 5 is where the weaning period takes place, where the father should take over from the mother as far as nurturing of the child. But also, that's the point where Hagar and Ishmael leave and they start to mock Isaac. So he's like, maybe the mocking of the persecution starts at this point. And if it does start at this point, this would be exactly 400 years from the Exodus. So whether we're trying to make it fit or it does fit, it's pretty interesting. And so back in the 1600s, he's like, if we say this is where it starts, then everything's perfect. Now we've got these 430 years through Egypt and Canaan. Then the family moves to Egypt. And then we have only 215 years in Egypt itself, which is the 4 generations. So it's just kind of cool. He makes it fit. Is it true? I like to think so, but I don't really know. But it's interesting. And as long as it's interesting, I'm hooked. So then how do we come up with all these dates? This chart's a mess. But when I kept looking at this, I'm like, this is awesome. Because they're always like, Abram was 70. I'm like, I don't see that in the Bible. How are you coming up with this garbage? Well, this is how they do it. So if we agree 967 on the right of the chart, that's the Solomon's Temple. And then we go to First Kings and we go 480 years. So we have the Exodus about 1446. So we got that. And we just read the promises of the 430 years to Abram is 430 years earlier. So then we got 1876. Now we know Abraham was 75 years old when they made those promises. So that's how they come up with the 1951 as the date of Abraham. Does that make sense? So we're using multiple different things. We think we know Solomon's Temple. Now we got First Kings, then we got Galatians, and then we've got Genesis. So we got Abraham being born. So we're back to 1951. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. 1851. Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born. So we're going back forward now. So that's when Jacob was born. But when was Joseph born? Well, what they do is they use different parts of the Bible. So if you look at Genesis 47:4, and I have it up here in the middle, then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. So at this point, when Joseph brings Jacob in to meet the Pharaoh, we know he's 130 because he told us. So Jacob is 130 years old. So then if we look down here, assuming all this is right, which seems to make sense, Jacob's 130 years old. What point are we during Joseph's life? Well, these are the two major verses they use. First is Genesis 41:46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered into the service of Pharaoh. So, okay, we got 30 years. And then at Genesis 45, verse 6, let me read that. Sometimes I read this stuff, but I don't really dig into it because it is like, my brain hurts. So Genesis 45, verse 6, and this is how they interpret this one. It sounds a little better when we get away and we get more to old interpretations, but for these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 more years in which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. So we look at the older transcriptions, we're in the second of the 7 years of famine. So there's already been 7 years of collecting plus 2 years in the famine. So that's 9 years. So what they do is, well, Joseph must be 39 because he said he was 30 years old. Plus, we have 7 years later. So if we take Jacob at 130 years old minus 39 years, then he was 91 years old when he had Joseph. And that's how they come up with the calculated 1700 for the date of Joseph. So it's kind of cool. A lot of work. A lot of work. I don't know if you can come up with this unless you have some kind of archaeological or historical data to give you dates. I mean, you can, but I thought this was really interesting. So, like, we're pretty confident that Joseph was born around this time. So, around these 1600s should be when he was there. It matches with the second intermediate period of the Egyptians, which then will have the Exodus later than this, obviously. So I just thought that was pretty fascinating. It's one of those things to kind of stare at for about 3 days, but it's cool. I thought this was a good chart to kind of like, oh yeah, because when you just read it, it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm very visual, so I have to actually kind of go through it with my finger. So this is what we're looking at. Assuming the 215 years was just in Egypt, Joseph is during the second intermediate period where the Hyksos people are. There's not a lot of archaeological evidence there. It's a very intermediate time. And then when Moses is going to lead them out during the Exodus is probably during the New Kingdom. And there's tons of pharaohs. And that's why there's so much controversy. Who is the pharaoh? Who is the pharaoh? Um, you know, which is just interesting to read. Who knows who's right? So the timeline of ancient Egypt. So if we assume we're in the second intermediate period now during Joseph, at this time Egypt was split in half. The pharaohs, the Egyptians, didn't control the whole area at all. They only controlled the southern part, which would be called the Upper Egypt. So this confused me. They call it according to the flow of the Nile. So the Nile's flowing this way. So the geographic southern part's called Upper Egypt, and the geographic northern part's called Lower Egypt, which I kept reading that thing. I think they messed it up, but it's because of the flow of the Nile. So at this time, Upper Egypt, or the geographic southern part, were controlled by the pharaohs, were controlled by the typical Egyptians we're thinking of. But the Lower Egypt, the land of Goshen, or this fertile crust, this fertile area, was actually controlled by people called the Hyksos during this period. So the question is, did the Hyksos people come after Joseph and after the Exodus, or was Joseph and his people the Hyksos people? There's two leading archaeological groups that are arguing on this, so I'm going to present them both. I think they're really cool. I'm pushing towards, well, I don't know. I don't know what I'm pushing towards because all I'm doing is just I don't have any thoughts of my own. These are all theirs. So, but during this period, we have the Egyptians on this geographic lower part, Upper Egypt, and we got these Hyksos Semites on this Upper Lower Egypt. And so the interesting thing is, when you look at Lower Egypt, at the time it was called the land of Goshen. So we're going to read verses about that. They go into the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen correlates with this Lower Egypt, this Nile River Delta. And then when we look at different cities within there, this Avaris city, if you see to the right side, Avaris was the ancient name of Ramses, that famous city of Ramses they keep talking about. What they found is Avaris was actually archaeologically under the Ramses. So likely when they're talking about Ramses in the Bible, Avaris was the city at the time they would have referred to it as. So how well do the Hyksos fit with the establishment of Jacob's family in Egypt? The video, well, and I'll show this in a bit. The video says all this happened, then the Hyksos came in. some people are like, we think the Hyksos were kind of associated with the Israelites. And why do we say that? Well, there's archaeological evidence pointing to that, not proving it, but then some of the earliest Egyptian historians called the Hyksos the Israelites, the Semites, the corn gatherers. So I'm like, well, that's an interesting coincidence. If after the Exodus, then the Hyksos come in, why are they called shepherds? And why are, so it's just kind of interesting to look at. But what we should look at from the World History of Encyclopedia, there's piecemeal evidence for the reign of the Hyksos, which is unsurprising considering later Egyptian rulers they blot out. You're going to blot out these intermediate periods. There's not going to be a whole lot there because it wasn't when they were in control. If you lose battles or if you're not in control, there's not much to carve about. So you're not going to spend your time carving different things unless it looks positive for your kingdom. So here's some of these famous archaeologists. They were never in Egypt. There's no historical proof that they were even enslaved or even existed. It's a biblical fairy tale. This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, blah, blah, blah. The Israelites did not emerge from an exodus. And these are some of the famous Egyptian Egyptologists, um, archaeologists. Now, this is back in the 90s, except for Israel Frankenstein. They might have changed their tune, but I'm doubting it. So let's review kind of what we have from the Bible. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all pitched their tents on the plain of Mamre near Hebron. So if you look here, this is just south of Jerusalem. And then we go on, Jacob's sons often went north to Shechem to graze their flocks. Now, the difference from Hebron to Shechem, they say, is about 50, 60 miles. So they covered quite a bit of distance with their sheep. So these are probably some pretty big flocks, or maybe just the grassland was better there. And it was just north of Shechem, near the town of Dothan, that Joseph's brothers sold him to slavery. And so they've identified all these cities archaeologically. So they all exist, they're all there. And then what we're about to show is there's a lot of historical evidence that there was caravans that went right through Dothan. It was a major trading site where they actually went from Canaan down to Egypt. And so this is from one of the curator of the Egyptian Museum, and he says maritime trade. So they usually trade through water between Egypt and a city called Byblos. It ceased around the 17th century. They stopped having evidence of that, and it was replaced by overland trade caravans. And he kind of goes through near Dothan was a major port for this overland trade. And what his quote was from the study is if Joseph's brothers had not spotted the initial Ishmaelite caravan, they probably wouldn't have had to wait very long before another such caravan appeared on the horizon. Dothan was near a major trade artery. So he's like, we have a lot of evidence. This matches perfectly because this was a major trade route right about Dothan. It wouldn't have made much sense if they were way down farther south, but it's just interesting how everything really fits well. So here we have the timelines. David Roll was the big guy that was in that video Patterns of Evidence Exodus. He's the Egyptologist. He's also an atheist. So he doesn't believe in God, but he thinks this matches the Bible. So whatever. So on the left here, we have this is the typical timeline for Egypt, and then David's Roll's timeline for Egypt, he switches. He says there's too many gaps in time periods of all the surrounding nations if you only go by Egypt. So he says that third intermediate period is too long. They've expanded it by too many years, so we need to pull it back. And he might be right. I don't know. But what he says is if you do my revised timeline, with most Egyptologists and archaeologists do not agree with him. But if you go with his timeline, and I blew it up on the right side here, he's going to have Joseph arrives, the Israelite arrives, we have the Exodus. After the Exodus, these Hyksos people come in. And he's like, well, this makes sense because the Egyptian army was defeated. Most of them were killed in the Red Sea. They were all so now Egypt is super weakened. This gives the opportunity for these Semite Hyksos to come down and take over the land of Goshen. So to him, it makes perfect sense. Egypt's at its weakest point. This is the easiest time to take over. And he's like, and if you actually follow this timeline, which matches better with these gaps through the surrounding nations, this would fit. And this might be right. I have no idea. But there's so many coincidences with Jacob's family and the Hyksos that it's kind of fun to kind of juggle them back and forth. So this is what he would say. Most people outside of him would not agree with this. They would put kind of the Hyksos people at the time where Joseph and his family were there. So just kind of two different viewpoints. Nobody really knows, but it's pretty cool to look at. So how do we know about these Hyksos? There's not a whole lot of evidence, but we have this Egyptian historian called Manetho. Manetho is the primary historian of early Egyptian um, history. So every one of his original records have not been found. They don't know where they went, but you can reproduce them all through other historians. And one of the biggest historian that quotes Manetho is Josephus. So like we think we know everything he wrote, though we can't find any of his original manuscripts. So it's kind of interesting. So what we know about him is going to come from a few archaeological relics plus this guy. So what does Manetho say about these high coast people? He says, well, they're known for shepherding in multicolored garments. Now we know Joseph had a garment that was multicolored. We do not know if all the people wore multicolored garments, and that garment was destroyed anyway. So I don't know if that's just coincidence, if that what they wore at the time, but it's pretty interesting. He says these high coasts first came to Egypt in the context of gathering corn, which wouldn't match if it's long after the Exodus, because this is long after the famine. But who knows? They rose in power before they were overthrown. Then they were thrown out of Egypt to a country which is called Judea, and they built a great city called Jerusalem. That's pretty coincidental. If Manetho, the early Egyptian historian, saying the Hyksos people did all the same things that the children of Israel would have done, you know, Josephus makes the case that they were indeed none other than the Israelite forebears. So some of the early historians are actually linking the Hyksos with the Israelites. Where David Rohl would be like, that's impossible. They came much later. The Egyptian army was weakened because of the Exodus, which also makes sense. He also, I'm not gonna, there's a lot of words I put up here, but Manetho also said they were brutal. They came in, they destroyed Egypt, they destroyed the temples, they burnt all these cities, they overpowered the Egyptians. So Manetho says these Hyksos came in, they were pretty aggressive. Now remember, most historians, Greek historians with Assyria and all that, if it doesn't benefit their culture, they usually make them seem a lot worse than they were. And sometimes they even make up lies about them. So Manetho's like, these Hyksos are horrible. They burn and burn and burn. But then we go and we see that archaeological evidence doesn't prove any of this. So one more point on this slide. Manetho names the first ruler or king of these Hyksos, and he says his name is Salitis. So we'll just keep that in mind because we're going to go through. Salitis happens to be the name of governor of Joseph, which is kind of an interesting coincidence also. So Manetho's like, these people were horrible. Well, let's look more recently what they found with the archaeological evidence of these Hyksos people. So this is out of the World History Encyclopedia. So in the course of the 13th dynasty, successful trade and immigration brought an influx of Semitic people to Avaris, which is kind of the Ramses. They gained wealth and power. These people were known to the Egyptians and themselves as Hakua Kasat, which means rulers of a foreign land. But they were called Hyksos by the Greek writers, and that's the name that stayed. So we all refer to them by the Greek name Hyksos. Mantheo's report of brutal conquerors was taken as historical fact by scholars and laymen for centuries until really the 1900s when they started doing archaeological excavations of this. What they found is there's been no stronghold at Memphis, no widespread destruction. All these things that Mantheo said they did, there's been no evidence of that whatsoever. So instead, what they think happened is they came in, they arrived at Avaris, they came from Syria, Palestine, and they somehow established wealth and power. So it's pretty similar to the story of Joseph when we look at that. And the bottom one's just another article. This lady is supposed to be one of the primary researchers on the High Coast people. And what she says is the High Coast had a diplomatic impact, contributing to progress and culture rather than an invasion. It appears that the centralized authority of Egyptian kings declined, increasing their local power by a coup or until slow, peaceful process. And then these high coast type people became kings in their own right, which would fit Joseph being a governor under the Pharaoh. I mean, kind of, not exactly, but it's interesting. So let's look at this capital of Avaris. So this capital of Avaris is where the high coast people came in and they made it their capital, which also fits very well with the Ramses from the Bible because it's the same area. And so, according to Manetho, these Hyksos, they're the ones that came in to the ancient city of Avaris. They're the ones who founded it, which we're told in the Bible, that's kind of the area, at least, where Joseph was. They were shepherds. And then when we look at the archaeological excavations from Avaris, they say it's clearly a foreign Semitic population with housing styles similar to the Canaanites. They're also found little bits of sacrificial area or animals, but no pigs, leading them to think this might have been a kosher type of people or system. if most of us, I think, have seen this patterns of evidence Exodus where they really go through. When they were going through and excavating Avaris, they found one building that was quite a bit bigger than the rest of them. So, like, this is some kind of important person. It's like a temple, and it happened to have 12 pillars in the courtyard. In the grounds, it happened to have 12 tombs. And then one of the tombs just happened to be pyramidal and larger, which was not common. That only during this time period would take place for pharaohs or people of royalty. So they're like, there seems to be this Semitic city with this big, almost like a pharaoh-like building. And then there happens to be 12 columns. Maybe they're looking into this, but there was also 12 tombs. And there was no bones in any of these tombs, but one of the tombs was a pyramid tomb, which they said you wouldn't have expect to see that with Semitic people. And there was a little bit of a broken statue. So the picture to the left from the actual people who did the excavation of this, they found pieces of a statue. And the drawing is when they put the pieces together, what it should have looked like. And this was a Semitic type of person. And there was a little bits of hints of color. And so from the video, this is the video from Patterns of Evidence they made him look like, because they found there was like reddish hair and yellow skin, which had been a Semitic the way the Egyptians presented them. Plus there was different colors across the robe. And so Patterns of Exodus is like, well, this is definitely Joseph. It's got to be Joseph. But they're taking a biblical standpoint. But even if you read Robert Scheitzels and some of the original excavator that went through this, that do not believe this has anything to do with Joseph, don't even really believe the Bible, this is some of their quotes, except for the last one. The interesting thing about this statue, it was found in a pyramid tomb, which was only given to royalty. So they're already like, this house doesn't belong here. It's too big. Why did a Semitic character have this? And where were the bones? There's no bones in any of these tombs. If you're going to ransack a tomb, you're not going to take the bones. So, like, if anybody was ever buried in these tombs, they were obviously moved somewhere else. Now, we know Jacob and we know Joseph asked to be buried, in the land of their fathers. We don't know about the other ones. I mean, who knows? But maybe they weren't buried there. But it's pretty interesting. The statue was also larger than life. It was about 2 times normal size of a human, which again you would only see with royalty and pharaohs. So they're like, this doesn't fit. We got a Semitic statue of a guy. It's too big. It's in a pyramid tomb. It's next to a huge complex where everything else in Avaris seems to be Semitic. It's not Egyptian. So then, of course, biblical people are like, well, maybe this is the prestige that Joseph would have received, especially as a governor or a mini pharaoh of the land. So this seems to fit in the time period and also with the biblical story, which is super interesting. There's no other explanation. They either blow it off as some other high coast Semitic person or Joseph, which I think is pretty cool. So when they excavate this, they found this land of Avaris is in the exact same area as the later Ramses. So whether they started building the city, which would become Ramses under Ramses a few hundred years later, or whether it was always Avaris, we don't know. But all the Semitic stuff is in the lower layers of Avaris, and more of the Egyptian type of stuff later came on the upper layers of Ramses. So this is definitely the Canaanite, Israelite, high coast people that started in this Avaris city, which is pretty cool. Massive grain silos found throughout Lower Egypt. There's grain silos found out in all kinds of places throughout the world, but these are huge and massive, and there's even carvings showing complex staircases going up and going down to get to these. So it's interesting that around this lower region of Egypt, there's massive grain silos, bigger than they find almost anywhere else. That seems to match the biblical story of 7 years of plenty where they store up grain. Pretty interesting. How am I doing on time? Yeah, we're fine. I'll try to slow down now. Now that it's too late. All right. So this again, when they present the high coast people, this is off of Khutenhotep II. Anyway, when they talk about the Semitic or the high coast people, they always put them in these colorful garments, which I don't know if that's what they wore at the time. Or are they just saying because of the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors? That part I don't necessarily buy unless we have evidence that they all wore these beautiful coats. Joseph's coat was destroyed. So the statue of Joseph with his multicolor, if he had another one made, maybe that's possible. But as far as the actual coat, I mean, the coat was destroyed. So all these people are wearing these multicolored colored. I mean, do we have any evidence that's what the Jacob's family wore? They seem to really push that, but I'm like, I'm not sure where that's coming from. But I mean, I don't know. It's just interesting. So how about the 7 years of famine? This is the one they really say that matches the Bible. I don't buy this. I think this is just a copy of the Bible. But this famine stele is a big boulder. It's found outside the Nile River on a little island, and it has engravings that match really commonly with the Bible of the famine. In a period of 7 years, grain was scant, kernels were dried up, scarce was every kind of food, children cried, and all this stuff. Everybody was in distress. So some people are really hardcore, like this proves the Bible's famine. But this came in the second or third century. So this could have just been an Egyptian copying what's coming from the Bible. So it's an interesting parallel, but if I was not a Bible believer, I'm not sure this would convince me, but it's interesting. It's interesting. To me, this is just a repeat of the Bible. But what I do find interesting is there's archaeological evidence of this major famine on people that aren't looking at Bible archaeology. So the Chinese Emperor Shen Tang, who founded the Shang Dynasty, he's recorded specifically talking about a 7 year famine that happens to match with those almost the exact time frame. This is way over in China. There is archaeological evidence of starving Indo-European tribes invading Western China, which they say also introduced the chariots and all to China. Yemen, there is a tablet that reveals a 7 year famine in Yemen that they date that to about the same time. So there is some separate type of things. The biggest one is a study that came out in 2022. Did a mega drought topple empires 4,200 years ago? And so this is just one quote from here, from Weiss, one of the authors. We got Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Aegean, the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain. And all these places, there's evidence of a drying climate, collapse of central authorities, and for people moving to escape the newly arid zones. So there's quite a bit of evidence. Now, the date is the issue. They don't even agree on the date because carbon 14 dating, sometimes we're not quite sure how accurate this is. So even some of the authors itself are like, we're not sure about our dating on this. This date wouldn't match, but it's interesting that we have all this evidence from different cultures of this great famine, possibly around the same time. So I think this is more convincing than the famine steel, but it's really neat. Accuracy of the Bible, this comes from the old book. When we read the story of Joseph, it matches other archaeological findings around that same time. Royal bakeries and butlers were huge on this time. There were multiple for each pharaoh, and there's all kinds of hieroglyphics of the different chores they would have. So that matches beautifully. Shaving. Genesis 41, Pharaoh sent out and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came unto Pharaoh. Yehuda said, in the eyes of Semitic people, the beard was a mark of dignity. Only prisoners and slaves were shaved as a sign of humiliation and dishonor. The Egyptian had an opposite view, and the first thing every Egyptian of better standing was anxious to do, as soon as he came of age, was to deliver his head and beard to the razor. So this would kind of fit. And they even have, kind of archaic pictures of people shaving. From jewelry and linen, there's all kinds of different pictures and statues of Egypt's with their jewelry and with their gold and with their chains. And so when we read that Pharaoh took off his ring, put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in gestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck, that is consistent. There's many other engravings that aren't biblical, and one I put down here. In the 14th century, high priest Mary Ra was given the gold chain because he filled the storehouse with spelt barley. And so there's different things that match this. People who did good things for the pharaoh were given these linens and this jewels, which fits the time period. Chariots. Joseph's story prominently features chariots. These chariots were thought to be brought to started using widely in Egypt around the time of the Second Intermediate. There's little pieces of it before then, but this is the main time where they start finding these chariots. So that fits really nice. From this book, the late Egyptologist Professor Kenneth Kitchen, he paid attention to the fact Joseph's sale price was 20 shekels. He's like, that's not even just a coincidental thing. He's like, if we look at the evidence here, the standard slave price was about 10 shekels. After the 18th and 17th century, prices rose, and the average price was about 30 shekels. They have the writings of how much they sold their slaves for. So he's like, the Bible's claim that Joseph's brothers sold him for 20 shekels of silver fits perfectly within this time frame. It's right between the 20 and 30 shekels that we know about. So that's really interesting. I'm almost done. Now let's compare Manetho's description of the Hyksos to the Bible. So Manetho, the early Egyptian historian, said, these people are called shepherds, and their descendants kept possession of Egypt. And then he talks about how they were pushed off later on. that this nation called shepherds were also called captives in their sacred book. What sacred book are we talking about here? There's no mention of the Hyksos having a separate book. The Hyksos, on most people, said they were very polytheistic. They worshipped all the Egyptian gods, which we'll talk about. But this is kind of interesting that this is how Manetho describes the Hyksos. So if we read Genesis 47, then Joseph came to Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brother and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen." So this matches the Hyksos. They come out of Canaan into Goshen. And he took some of his brother and even 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Thy servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." Exactly what Manetho said the Hyksos were. They were all shepherds. He mentions that multiple times. And then said, moreover, unto Pharaoh, "For to sojourn in the land we are come, for thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine. Now, therefore, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen." And the land of Goshen is Lower Egypt, where Avaris and all these are. So everything matches really well as far as the Hyksos people. Is there any uh, is it possible to identify any individuals? This is kind of pushing it, but I thought this was interesting. The only records we have during this time is the Turin King list. And this Turin King list, they only found parts. So this is it. This is supposed to be a complete list of kings during the second intermediate period, but all they found were these pieces. So they tried to put them together where they would go, but you're not getting a whole lot of complete names. So it's very incomplete. But then you also have Manetho through other historians listing these different kings during the second intermediate period. So this is all we have. It's very scarce. What's interesting though, there's very complete lists during the good periods of Egypt. There's all kinds of lists. I mean, the King Tut and Ramses, but during these intermediate periods, it's very scarce. And so what they say here is later Egyptian pharaohs probably erased the history of the dynasty. Even today, they're not found any Hyksos written texts, inscriptions, tombs, frescoes, sculptures. Everything that could somehow remind of the power of the Hyksos were destroyed by the later New Kingdom pharaohs, which might be the truth. And they've seen that in other cases. So this is all we have to go off of. So that's pretty scarce. What's interesting, this seal of Yakabhar has been found all over the place. There are more than 30 of these royal scarab seals found throughout Canaan and throughout Egypt. They seem to match sort of the 17th century. And Yakub is the exact transliteration of the Semitic name Jacob. So was Jacob some kind of high authority under Joseph? We don't know, but there was some Jacob that was of high authority through Canaan and through Egypt. So this is interesting, and he was a Hyksos. Issachar. There is an inscription above a door jamb in Avaris when they did the original archaeology that says Sakur Har. Sakur means reward, and Har just matches kind of their language. So they say this name closely parallels that of Jacob's son Issachar. The biblical name Issachar or Issachar means there is a reward. Um, so Leah, when she said God has granted me a reward, Issachar, so they named him Issachar. We don't know. There's only one engraving, but when you look at the Turin King list, this Issachar, which probably wasn't the same one, ruled for about 10 years. He was the fourth or fifth king or pharaoh or leader of the Hyksos. The coolest one, I think, is Joseph. If we remember back Manetho, his first Hyksos ruler was named Salatus. So I'm going to quote him here. At length, they, the Hyksos, made one of themselves king, whose name was Salatus. He also lived at Memphis and made both the upper and lower regions pay tribute. Thither Salatus came in summertime, partly to gather his corn. Then we go back to Genesis, and Joseph gathered corn as the sands of the sea very much until he left numbering, for it was without number. So that kind of parallels, and that's interesting. If we look at the governor, so in the Bible, Genesis 42:6, and Joseph was governor of the land. So Pharaoh made him second to Pharaoh. The word governor under is H7989 on Strong's. It's uniquely different from the other um, from that used dozens of other times throughout the Bible. So here the title is Salit, naming him Joseph the Salit, which a lot of people say it's an uncanny match for his first Hyksos king, Salit or Salitus. So Joseph the Salit, it is pretty interesting. It might just mean governor. So the first one might be governor. But they thought that was kind of an interesting thing. The second king, according to Manetho, was a Hyksos king named Benon. And so when we read Genesis 35:18, it came to pass as the soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. So some of these biblical archaeologists say, well, maybe if Joseph was the first governor, we don't know what happened after that, but maybe Benjamin would be the second one. Why would that be? Well, maybe because it's his only full half brother from Rachel. When we look at references, he received 5 times the portion. They gave him hundreds of pieces of silver, 5 changes of raiment. We don't really know. We don't know, but it's an interesting coincidence as far as the name goes. That is this possible? Couple more, and I promise I'm done. High Coast religion. Manetho is interesting, which kind of follows. He says the early High Coast were known for a degree of monotheism. Very unusual. Everybody knows the Egyptian gods, Ra, and all this. So that was unique. And also, at the arrival, they demolished the temples of the gods. Now, we don't have this widespread destruction that Manetho said the High Coast did. There's no evidence of that. But there is some evidence of some of this, some like temple altar destruction. So that's interesting, except that's only Manetho. If you look at the general Hyksos, if you just look up Hyksos on Google, they're polytheistic. They had a reverence towards the Egyptian god Seth. They also worship Baal. So most of the Hyksos people, when we look, they were polytheistic. But is that possible that maybe Joseph and his family came in and they kept the true faith, but then as time goes on, some of the people started worshiping false gods? I mean, that's kind of a common theme. Well, even that matches the Bible because if we look at a couple areas, even in Genesis 35 that precedes this, Jacob said to his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you and be clean and change your garments. And they gave Jacob all the strange gods that were in their hand and all the earrings in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak, which was by Shechem. So that precedes this. But now we go to Joshua. And what does Joshua say about this? Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him sincerely and in truth, and put away other gods which your father served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve ye the Lord. And then he goes on to say, I will serve the Lord. So he's even saying this, Joshua's saying himself, that you guys serve some of the Egyptian gods. So it's possible if the High Coast maybe had something to do with these people that they were worshiping some of the Egyptian gods at a time. Last thing is, who was the Pharaoh of Joseph? Who was the Pharaoh of Exodus? There are books and studies on this, and it's really, really, really interesting. But there's not that many people if you agree with this timeline. So Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it upon Joseph's hand. If we agree this 15th century makes sense, the 12th or 13th doesn't, because we know that Ramses wasn't the current city of Ramses. Avaris, Avaris, Avaris. But if we look, the 13th dynasty endured for about 150 years with evidence of more than 54 pharaohs, tons of pharaohs, putting the average length to only 3 years. So only 4 pharaohs reigned longer than 10 years. So if you agree with the timeline and you know this pharaoh under Joseph reigned longer, it has to be one of these four. There's some really interesting articles that I don't know. The Menafir A, never heard of the guy in my life. The most convincing to me, being sort of a layperson reading this, if you agree with the timeline, would have been the Pharaoh of Joseph. I have no idea. This would make an interesting study. Who's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Oh my goodness. If you Google search this, there's like 500 names that come up. Now, Manetho, Sharmalan, who's a first century historian, and Josephus all said it was Imhotep II. They all put him originally as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, matching this timeline. But there's been all these other people that have been picked. Ramses II is the most common one in all the movies. The Hollywood one doesn't make sense. I'm not buying it. It's too far. It's in the New Kingdom. There's no evidence of that because they were probably long gone into the judge's kingdom area at that point. The interesting thing is Thutmose III was the daddy of Amenhotep, and Thutmose the fourth was the son. And what they say, it's interesting about this Thutmose, Amenhotep, and Thutmose is none of these were the firstborn son. So Amenhotep was not the firstborn son of Thutmose III, and Thutmose IV was not the firstborn son of Amenhotep II. So isn't that an interesting coincidence? Could this have been during the time of the death of the firstborn? It could just be coincidence, but that's cool. So that kind of fits the timeline of one of these three people. And then David Rohl puts Thutmose II because he shifts the timeline quite a few hundred years. So why did we go through all this? Because I think it's cool. I think it only strengthens the faith that we can back this up. I think archaeological historical evidence does more to back the Bible up than it does to try to disprove it. Unless we're just saying Ramses didn't exist, and we throw it off without really looking at the evidence. So I think it's not conclusive whatsoever, but it's super interesting. It makes us want to dig into these stories more, I think. And I think it does more to support than to contradict the Bible. Thank you.